So welcome to this panel on creating neurodiverse friendly schools. My name is Ava Green. I'm the Assistant Director for Autistic Children's Services at Bradford District Care Trust. Day to day, my job is to kind of coordinate a really exciting piece of work that builds on a lot of the amazing things you've been hearing today from Boyd Bradford in the opportunity area, which is all about kind of combining really exciting data science, data tools with place-based working and co-production, seeing if that helps us better coordinate services around children, particularly vulnerable children, rather than requiring those children and their families to spend all their time working around services. And that feels like the right way around for the equation. However, my part in that is really quite dull because it involves going to programme boards and committees and filling in dashboards. So that's my job, is to try and do that bit of it. So excellent people like my panel can get on and do really exciting and important work. So without further ado, I'm going to ask my panel to introduce themselves and then we'll get on with the session. So away you go.
Hi, afternoon everybody. My name is Ruth Dennis and I'm Principal Educational Psychologist for Bradford, and I'm leading, or one of the leads, because there's quite a few of us, for the Neurodiversity Future Pathways project.
Hi everybody, I'm Becky Salmon. I'm the Centre County Manager for Cambridgeshire, so that's our psychologists, our specialist teachers in that county.
Hello there, my name is Alex Ogonaskich. I'm a SENCOM teacher and I work at Leadcliff Primary School in Manville here in Bradford.
Hello, my name is Nicole Dempsey. I'm the Director of SEND and Safeguarding at Dixon's Academies Trust.
Thank you, and again, thank you for offering your time up today. So I'm going to start with a definition, because I'll be honest, neurodiversity isn't something I understood very well, if at all, when I came into this a few months, years ago. And it's not a term that's particularly well understood generally. So I think let's start by trying to understand what we're talking about. So Ruth, if I could come to you and ask, what does neurodiversity actually mean? And because I have looked into it, what does it mean in terms of the principles? What does it change about our attitude to these conditions?
Sure, thank you. Okay, so I think traditionally as a society, we've tended to focus on differences and what sets young people apart, what sets adults apart. And so we've tended to look for things like what's different, what's autistic about somebody, or look for a diagnosis for conditions such as autism or ADHD or developmental coordination disorder. But what we found is that over time, we realised that a lot of those things overlap quite significantly. So you'll find that somebody who's autistic then also has an element of ADHD, and there'll be other elements that overlap. And what it tends to lead to is that diagnostic process is incredibly complex. Autism, ADHD and things like that aren't diagnosable through a blood test or anything straightforward. It's about behavioural observations. And so if we take those behavioural observations and start to think, well, actually, when you look at autism, when you look at ADHD, we're looking at differences in how people interact, differences in how people interface with different elements of their world. So, for example, sensory differences, differences around how they move or how they focus. And so what we started to try and do in Bradford is look at, rather than focusing purely on that diagnostic element, can we look at and think about the things that are differences and skill differences rather than having to have a label for it. So we're using the term neurodiversity to really put forward that proposition that rather than having deficits that need diagnosing and curing, we're really wanting to look at differences, and then with differences, seeing differences as just a part of that human condition, and as in we all look slightly different, we also all interact with the world slightly differently and experience things slightly differently. So neurodiversity is that way of acknowledging that we're all different, but instead of having to look for a diagnosis to manage those differences, we need to be working as organisations to think about how do we make reasonable adjustments so that if somebody finds it really difficult to wear a school uniform because it's really prickly for them or it irritates them, we don't say, I'm sorry, you have to have a diagnosis before we can do anything about that. We actually say, okay, so that's a difference that we need to accommodate, and the reasonable adjustment that we're going to make as a school is that we're going to do whatever. And so things like lunchtimes, young people can find it really difficult to go into a school lunch hall because of the sensory overload, the noise of all those people, the smells, all of those things. Rather than schools saying, I'm sorry, that's where the lunch hall is and that's what you need to do. It's about making those reasonable adjustments and saying, okay, so you're neurodiverse, we need to think about how we can accommodate those differences for you and give you a different way of accessing school meals.
Thanks, Ruth. That is really helpful. So what I'm going to do is just ask our panel to say a little bit about, from their perspective, what getting it right means. And getting it right in the terminology of our panel is creating a neurodiverse friendly environment. And just to sort of say from their point of view, maybe what the most important thing they would expect to see is, or what defines a neurodiverse friendly school, but also what the challenges of getting there. So if you could give us kind of your best example, that'd be great. And I'm going to come to you first, Nicole.
So for me, it's about everyone being able to get the needs met and feel part of the community as part of the main of what we do. Without the requirement for additional indifference, without the requirement for alternative spaces or arrangements, as far as possible. Sometimes those things are the right thing as well, but a constant drive to remove the systemic barriers and the challenges in the environment that are preventing people from being able to be part of the community that they should belong to fully. The absolute gold standard for that is considering a broad range of needs and hearing a lot of different voices and experiences and contributions at the design stage of something. And it's really easy to start talking about listening and valuing, but actually that's a step in the process as well. And the goal is for there to be an equal conversation, a discussion where everyone's a valid contributor on a level playing field, and that their experience and their voice is part of that design stage of whether that's a school or whether it's a particular project or the timetable or a school trip, that their needs and their experience are taken into account right from the very design stage, so that the vast majority of needs are met as part of the main of what you're doing. Now, obviously, we're not always there at the design stage, and a lot of what we're experiencing in our lives and in our day-to-day jobs and in how we interact with children in our settings is already established. So that commitment to designing things so that they meet the vast majority of needs as part of the main extends to a willingness to change and evolve and become different over time. As an education practitioner, I work in schools. That means that as we get different cohorts of children, as our cohorts evolve and change, not just looking at SEND and diversity, but also increasing numbers of children coming to us from other countries, not just speaking other languages, but having very, very different life experiences, different experiences that they're bringing, often traumatic. Being willing to look at the changing needs of our cohorts, and instead of providing more and more additional and different and alternatives, changing who we are as an organisation so that they can be a part of our community as far as possible, which requires, again, listening and valuing, but also learning how to be flexible and not relying on really, really rigid systems, being responsive as well as proactive, and trying to see ourselves as an evolving organic organisation and not something that this is the Dixon's way, this is how we do it, and you fit in or you don't. For me, the biggest challenge is that I've already kind of alluded to. It is difficult to turn a moving ship. And when you're talking about schools and whole academy trusts, then that's a pretty big ship to try to turn. And we've learned over the years that no one benefits from having the rug pulled out from under the feet, and quite often our young people and families are reliant on the familiar and the security of the familiar. So again, it comes back to not just listening and valuing, but making sure that you've got representation as part of the conversation, and that we take people along with us, that we're making change with people and not doing things to people, and that everyone understands the rationale and is able to participate and contribute to that change. And there are other challenges as well. But I think that process of managing the change itself is the thing that not only is very difficult, but is really important if we want to get it right in a sustainable way.
Nicole, that's fantastic. Thank you. I'll move us along. So, Alex, same question. So, from your point of view, obviously, loads there from Nicole. What can you add to that in terms of making this helpful? If we were to go into your school, what would we look for?
Thank you. I think it's really hard to say something new. The part of being, the silver lining of being at the end of the presentation is everybody has said something. But the good thing is that actually there is a pattern and there is a trend that all of us are saying the same thing. What makes an MD-friendly setting? There's three things: acknowledgement and understanding. We need to be aware. We are moving away from medical model. Something is wrong with people who are neurodiverse, into social model. Actually, we are accepting education. We have to educate people. I mean, today I have learned so many things, and I'm a part of the large inner city school. I came to this country from Bosnia 20 years ago, been teachers for 17 years, worked with asylum seekers and refugees, and for the last 3 years, one hosted, 2 years of pandemic and Senko, and I'm still learning something new. All the time. We learn something new all the time. And as you said, it's really important to be part of that domino effect that organically grows and accept that we learn all the time. We make mistakes. There's not much space for making mistakes, but that's the part of team integrity, doing something because it's the right thing to do. And enthusiasm, learn something new all the time. I go to my meetings, I meet people, I meet children and young people. We are not doing things to them, we are creating a system with them. Because quite frankly, they know how it is to live that life. They are experts, better than we are. So involve them, involve the parents. To my learned colleagues, you all know what Bronfenbrenner principles are. Thinking with a child and young person at heart. And that's what we do. Think and then move on. Move to the community, school. Not only the leaders, the ND profile and ND friendly schools. Think in terms of schools as the whole organism, from the head teacher to the cleaner and everybody in between. The parents, carers, siblings, and then moving into community. And what that head teacher said was sitting here, welcome to him. I don't know his name, so I do apologize. That collaboration, and the only way that this whole system will work better is through collaboration. So that's your team, that's your integrity, that's your enthusiasm. Now, when it comes to challenges, we can filter through the challenges and see two massive bodies. Everybody talk about budget, but there is a time problem as well, because children don't have time to waste. Nobody has time to waste. There's your time, there's your budget, there's your resources. That's on one side. But on the other side, and that is a challenge, is the mindset. In my role of Senko and the school teacher and the mother, I have come across experienced teachers and leaders and ECTs, early career teachers, who are simply having difficulty to accept the ND reality. Oh, pull your socks up. Oh, he's a bit fussy. Or, she's a bit spoiled. Well, no, actually, mindset. So if you think of the first, understanding and education and adaptation, that education is that changing that mindset and being enthusiastic enough to be willing to change your mindset. And that's the whole story. There's constantly thinking, there's so many good things in Bradford, act locally, born in Bradford, community hubs, all sorts of things are going. I've met some amazing people. Uri from St. Edmunds, absolutely stunning schools and people who work together, the community, the nursing, the school nurses, the visitors, the consultants. Collaboration will bring us together. When we
Alex, that's great. I'm going to stop you there just because the time's going. I want to make sure we got all this.
Sorry about that.
No, that's fantastic.
My soapbox.
Well worth using the soapbox. Becky, what do you want to add in terms of what neurodiverse friendly looks like in practice? And then we'll go to the audience.
Okay, I'll be really brief. So I think one of the most useful things that somebody once said to me is that the autistic spectrum isn't like a rainbow, it's not like a spectrum, it's more like a sound deck at the back. And there are some things that are turned up and some things that are turned down. And I think for us, the thing that we found in our project was listening to the people who know that for those children. So the children themselves, getting into the skin of what they think and what they find, and the families. And a lot of the families in our project were too frightened to say that to school because they thought they might be judged. And the schools knew that something was wrong, but because they weren't all talking together and being really, really curious, it was falling through the gaps. So for me, the only thing I would add is to always be curious about what's happening for your young people, because only then can you do something about it.
That's fantastic. And I got Ruth's consent in the margins to go straight out to the audience on the back of this one. One thing I would add here is, and from talking to all of you kind of offline, there's nothing that anyone's saying about what a neurodiverse friendly school looks like to me that isn't the same as what a really good school looks like. And in terms of the way the teaching's managed, I know this is something you talked to me about a year and a half ago, wasn't it? The fact that running it in this inclusive way is good for everybody. It's not just a kind of additional burden. But we're interested to know, because we don't know who's out here, apart from some faces we recognise. We don't know who's out there, where you work. But from what you've heard, does anyone want to say anything about what being neurodiverse friendly might mean, or they'd be curious about in their own organisations, and what's hard about doing that? We'd be interested to know. Yes, and then.
The Raspberry Pi Foundation, we create resources for groups to use. And a question I have really is, obviously neurodiversity incorporates so many different aspects. How do you ensure that you're being inclusive and catering for that variety?
I guess my stance on it would be to take it back to that whole notion of we're not looking at deficits, we're looking at differences. We can have differences in any number of domains, and I think if we try and sort of avoid it being sort of sidelined into you're autistic or you've got ADHD, and try and look at, well, what are the areas of need that young person has, and what can we do to support them? So, for example, if it's a young person who's autistic, they may have needs around social interaction, and so we'll be focusing on developing skills around social interaction and making reasonable adjustments around social interaction, rather than just focusing it down on it's because you're autistic, because you may also find that people with ADHD also have some of those differences around social interaction. So what we're trying to do is to look at those core underpinning skills rather than just focusing it on those individual different sort of clusters of differences.
And maybe just to add a kind of practical thing on that, if I may. So, awareness, people understanding, putting some training in place so people know what these conditions are. And then I think the second thing will be principles. You know, what are we trying to achieve? What kind of environment do we want people to be, in your case, sort of learning and interacting with the product in? And it comes back to these points about it being an inclusive, universal setting which can be adapted. And I think, so it's kind of the working through, well, how do you get people to create anything friendly? Well, they have to understand it, and they have to sort of buy into the principles of making it friendly, and then kind of dealt with half the battle there. Did you want to come in as well? So Alex.
Actually, I'd just like to add something. I mean, the core principle, but because I'm a Senko, I'm looking from that point of view. So if we have a four-part approach of assess, plan, do, and review, and we are thinking through it, somebody already said, what is good for special needs children with disabilities is good for everybody. So if we flip the narrative and we think, okay, I will plan for children with special needs or children with disabilities, and actually that is a really good quality first teaching for everyone. I would also like to add is that part of transition. Again, we are going back to that collaboration. Transition in school terms means somebody who's coming to me from nursery or somebody who's going from me to secondary school. It's sharing information. And it isn't always that the money is the power. Actually, the knowledge is the power and the information is the power. Again, you're going back to, in circles, you're going back to that collaboration.
Building on what Ava said, really, that having a broad range of experiences at the design stage is so powerful, but there is nothing that we can design that's going to continue to inherently meet everyone's needs. So once you've taken that opportunity, it is so important to be responsive and flexible to individuals, and that relies almost entirely on relationships and knowing people as individuals. And one of the things that we kind of realise retrospectively is the importance of teaching staff and the adults working with young people why relationships are so important, the neuroscience behind how relationships underpins our children's behaviour, not necessarily naughty behaviour, but just human behaviour, how it underpins their safety, how it underpins inclusion, and how it underpins all learning, which is a two-way communication between people. So being a relationships-based school, but also valuing what you learn through those relationships and being responsive and flexible enables you to continue to evolve and change in order to accommodate difference in different ways, and for that to be okay.
Fantastic. I think you were next, weren't you? And then there's a question on this side.
Hi, can you hear me? Yeah. I'm slightly deaf, that's why I asked. And I'm Amber, and I'm a Healthy Minds apprentice, and I'm 17 years old. And I left the secondary school having two wildly different experiences of being neurodiverse. My first school was so overwhelmed because it was a giant school that even if you came to them with a problem, they didn't have the resources to help. And there was also a stigma in the school society that if you were different, it was bad. And then I moved school to one in the Bradford area, and being neurodiverse was accepted more than it was previously. And being neurodiverse myself, I realised that I wouldn't have to hide anymore, and that really helped me be able to relax in lessons and just be a happier and healthier person. So my tip to any organisation is, like, sitting here, I'd definitely think about hiring some neurodiverse people, because we're really cool, and even if we waffle a bit, what we have to say is really important. So thanks.
Thank you very much for coming. I don't think anyone's going to argue with that. Neurodiverse people are really cool, so thank you. Yes.
My comment or question isn't going to be as cool as that, but thank you for sharing. So my name's Amber. I work at the University of Leeds around oral health and supporting autistic children in that space. I'm pulling out a lot of themes around collaboration and working with services. But from my work and speaking to professionals and parents, there's a lot of silo work that's happening, and there's a lot of services that don't know about each other, or there's a lot of duplication of work. And it's the same in schools, and whether schools are aware of all these services, or whether parents are aware of all these services that they can access. So I just want to know your thoughts on how we can bridge that gap and help with that.
I mean, it was, and we're talking getting off 20 years ago, the Children Act came in and tried to bring all the services together, and we still seem to be fighting the same battles. I think what's important is we're still fighting the same battles. That's because it's the right battle to fight. Doesn't mean doing it is any easier. But let's have any reflections on how to actually do it.
Yeah, I guess we are lucky in Bradford. We've got the Centre for Applied Education and Research, and I think that gives us a really strong forum to bring together people from across disciplines, from education, from health, from research backgrounds. And I think pulling them into that sort of like a really clear organisation where there's really strong links to being able to publicise and push out information in schools and into other organisations is a really good starting point because it enables us to have those conversations in a supportive context, and then, more importantly, make that available to schools. So the project that we're involved in at the moment, which is the Neurodiversity Future Pathway, is really about bringing together education colleagues, health colleagues, and colleagues from that research community to try and look at how do we ensure that schools are neurodiverse friendly, and how do we make sure that that work that we're doing pulls together the strengths from all of those organisations.
And the other thing I just add, because I like my analogies, is that I think we need to remain like a fruit salad. There's a danger when we're all doing the same thing to blend ourselves together into a smoothie, but it's so much tastier to be a fruit salad. So that's all I had.
Okay, so that's a metaphor of the day, if anyone wanted to take one away. Were there any other questions or reflections? Yes.
I'll own up and say that I work for the DFE. It's not all my fault.
Do you want to speak up?
Sorry, it's not all my fault, but some of it might be because I work for DFE. But I'm really interested because we hear a lot about training for teachers, particularly teachers, actually, very little emphasis on training for anyone else. But what I've heard you all describe is that there's lots of different strands to this, and the mindset and the culture side of things, and even some early career teachers, still not necessarily sharing an inclusive mindset, and others that have perhaps been in the game for a long time, fully embracing it. So I'm just interested to hear, what are your thoughts in terms of the balance between formal training and what actually can't be effective unless you're kind of talking about culture at the level of the setting. Does that make sense?
Can I get that?
Yeah, go for it. Good question.
Well, you hit the nail there. I mean, the whole point there is that it comes from the school. I'm very fortunate, so my head teacher is really inclusive, and it stems from there. So it does have certain buck has to stop somewhere, and it has to stop sometimes with the head teacher. So we do represent what we see. But when it comes to training, teacher training in particular, and I'm quite often asked to mentor with early career teachers, the whole point is they can learn so much from parents, from young children, and from the school itself. So I think that for any of these things to work, it has to be sustainable. Keep it simple, make it count, and the teacher training has to be looked at from that perspective.
Hi, the other thing I would just add to that is that training in isolation very rarely does anything. I think it's the practice and the application and seeing the same idea in as many different ways as you can, then you'll screw people up. And I think we do still think about training like a training course, and then you go and practice it. But all that modelling that we can do, all that learning from each other, really makes that stuff stick.
Teacher training at all levels, right from ITT, early careers, and the MPQ suite, not really preparing and continuing to prepare teachers to work in inherently inclusive, diverse schools was probably one of the biggest barriers that we've faced and that we continue to face. And thinking about what our own in-house offer for CPD has been really, really important and continues to be really important. And we took a two-pronged approach. One of the things that we did to kind of combat that was to embed inclusivity into other areas of training. So we don't really separately deliver CPD on SEND, on neurodiversity, but instead when we're delivering on teaching and learning or quality of education, we make sure that the SENCOR has input into that and that the strategies we're teaching are inclusive or aimed at a diverse classroom. When we're teaching about behaviour safeguarding, all of our policies, we try to embed it in that and not as a separate thing. The second thing we did is instead of delivering training on need types or broad areas of need or certain disabilities, We deliver training on our children specifically, where we put pictures of the children up on the screen and we talk about them as people, incorporating their voice, their parent and family's voice, experts that we've got supporting us, and really humanising and normalising the things that they need in order to be successful in our school and in our classroom. That runs alongside ensuring that our staff feel that they have permission to be responsive to those children, and not having behaviour systems or routines that are so rigid that they're at risk of causing harm to those children that do require something different. And that really comes down to trusting our staff, saying to them, you get to know this child, listen to everything that we've got to say, and then trust your gut as an adult that came here to get the best for children. Trust your gut and do what you need to do, and that has been really successful for us.
Thank you, that's really, really helpful. I think it's probably worth saying that when you have had this hammered lovingly into you all day, that what sort of runs through all the work you should be seeing in Bradford and being talked about today is that we're starting with what the evidence suggests is actually happening. So we're starting with an understanding of how vulnerabilities kind of come together and intersect and multiply in the most disadvantaged areas. And we're starting with place making a difference to how you design services and so on and so forth. And the advantage of that is that truth is a sort of subjective term, but if you're talking about a pretty accurate picture of what's going on, it's a lot easier to get staff to say, yeah, we can get behind this because it's what we see. I think when, and again, as someone who only left DFE a week and a half ago, I don't want to be too presumptive about it, but you know, when things are directed too narrowly, and then they end up on frontline services, and people say, well, that's not really the experience that I have or these kids have. So we're going to have to do stuff with it to make it work. We're trying to respond. What colleagues are doing is trying to respond to the way the issue plays out in front of them. That feels important. So we're going to move on to our last question. I would like to hear from you as well on it. But the simple thing is, so we've talked about what the vision is. So starting with you, Ruth, give us like the most important thing you're doing to try and get us to that vision, and then we'll ask you guys as well.
Okay, so the Neurodiversity Future Pathway, I think some of you have already seen our stall out there somewhere. It's really about a whole system change to have that shift in mindset towards looking at and thinking about neurodiversity and thinking about it as something that we need to make reasonable adjustments for, rather than having it as something we've got to sort of go down that diagnostic pathway for. And so the big pieces in this are really around how do we support schools to become neurodiversity friendly through delivering whole school training on neurodiversity. It's that hearts and minds of it, because none of this will happen unless people believe and are with you on that vision. And so we're doing whole school training, and as Alex said, that includes everybody from the community around the school to the families and to every member of staff and the young people themselves. So that's really important. And then we're looking at developing a neurodiversity friendly schools charter, which really supports children and supports schools to sign up and sort of sign in black and white on what they're actually going to do to make themselves more neurodiversity friendly. And the third big plank of this project is around the neurodiversity profile tool. And the profile tool is something that's going to help special needs coordinators really drill down on the individual skill differences that young people may have, and how they can then build on that to support them both through reasonable adjustments and through putting different practices into place and support plans into place. So the whole school training, the neurodiversity charter and the neurodiversity profile are the three big pieces of work that we're working on now to try and move this forward into reality.
Thanks, Ruth. Go on, Becky.
So we've got a project running at the minute because we were really concerned that a number of our girls were seeming to cope quite well in primary school, and then when they went to secondary school things were falling apart for them, and we saw that in our tier 4 that lots of our girls were going into tier 4 and then coming out with an autism diagnosis is one of the many things. But and so what we're looking at is, can we intervene earlier? Can we look at what's happening for our girls in primary school before they get to secondary school? And then we're putting in training for all of our schools involved in primary and secondary, but extending that training, like you were saying, to our social workers and our family workers and anybody else who might come into contact with those girls. And one of the things that I'm most pleased about in our project is that we've We've written a child letter that goes, if there is a diagnosis, that goes with the diagnosis, that explains that basically your life is over and actually you're probably more amazing than you thought you were in the first place. So that's what we're doing.
Thank you, Becky. Go on, Alex. Tell us a thing.
I think it's the most important part if we manage to get to the end, say in 5 years' time, it's co-production. It's working with young people and their families and us as part of multi-agencies and creating that system where people are acknowledged for who they are and they're valued. So that, if I'm to do one thing, that would be co-production. Thank you.
I want to give 2 examples from Dixon's. I'll try to be really concise. And first of all, I was really lucky to be there at Dixon's Trinity Academy, one of our startup free schools, at the design stage. And we were able to look at the sector and the state of SEND in education and take what worked and disregard what wasn't working. We wanted to design a school that didn't rely on labels or diagnoses, but that were inherently designed to meet a broad range of need as part of the main of what we do. We took a zero tolerance stance to segregated provision, and we designed a staffing and timetable structure that was designed to be flexible and responsive and offer alternatives and spaces without reducing the quality of experience for any of our children. We knew that we would have children with neurodiverse differences and SEN. We knew that we would probably have quite a high SEN demand, and we wanted to be proactive. And of course, there is still additional and different for those children that require it, but always equal quality and never a disruption to the broad and balanced curriculum that we offer. What that looks like now, coming up 10 years later, is a secondary school where we don't have any teaching assistants or by any other name. We don't have any withdrawal intervention. We don't have a SEND department or a SEN or inclusion area within the school. We do have a pretty high incidence of SEN. We're about 17% SEN support and 4.2% EHCP. And our children have, we've achieved a Progress 8 score, a SEN Progress 8 score of around +1 every year that we've had GCSE results. So we're really bucking the trend academically. But that's not really the thing. Our learners with SEND, our children, our neurodiverse children, are proportionally and equally represented in behaviour, rewards, trips, everything that we do. All means all. We never leave anyone behind. And all of our children go to all of the lessons all of the time. And that has been really important to us. And we've had to be flexible and responsive in order to maintain that over the years. Now that we have that experience, we're able to take that learning and apply it across the trust and share it with others in settings like this. So it continues to be really important, and we continue to work really hard to maintain that at Dixon's Trinity. The second example I wanted to give really, really quickly is again about getting in there at that design stage and ensuring that our primary schools have the resources to go out into the communities and meet with children and families before they ever step foot in the school at the first stage that we know about them, and start to build those relationships, but also ask key questions, do certain assessments, so that when they arrive on the first day that we're ready for them, that knowledge that we've gained is embedded in our offer, and that the things that they need are there right from the very start.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Nicole. So we've got a few minutes. I would be very interested to hear anything you're doing that you want to tell us about that you think should be heard, or if you've got any questions to the panel. Yes, thank you.
This is a bit of a plug for my own project, really. We'll come back to co-production and the...
Just hold it a little bit closer.
Sorry. Yeah, it's a bit of a plug for my own project. I'm part of the West Yorkshire Deep Dive for neurodiversity, specifically autism and ADHD. And just coming back to co-production, we're really interested in speaking to young people and their families. So just get in touch with you guys and see if you can actually come out and meet the people you're working with as well, and some feedback about what's working, what isn't, what changes you've made that maybe we could put across for the rest of West Yorkshire, because different areas are quite dramatically different from each other in what they're offering autistic ADHD children.
Sounds good. First West Yorkshire, then beyond the world.
And the one.
Of course, I've one more if anyone wants one more, or we can acknowledge the heat. Oh no, yes.
Hello, I'm Helen Jones from Strong Coast Nursery School in Keighley, and we have 30 part-time equivalent places for children with complex special needs. And we build our specialist provision bases very much around the children's sensory needs, their passions and their interests. And that has really reflected into a simple thing that we've done in our entrance, which is we have a big screen and we project onto there sensory videos from underwater to lava lamps, or even choristers at Christmas from King's College, Cambridge. And this just helps create that calming atmosphere as soon as children and families are coming in. And we have services that use our upstairs and they're just coming back to work now. And they just say it makes a difference to their day when they come in. And so that's something where it's something to help support our children, but it helps everybody.
That's fantastic, and I'm going to suggest we stop there before we get thrown off the stage. But I think hopefully the reflection you've taken away from this is that you look at the evidence of what happens if we don't try and help neurodiverse children develop into kind of confident, successful, capable adults, and the statistics are pretty damning. But more importantly, it's possible. We're following the evidence here, which is logically the thing to do, and you combine that with some creative and bold leadership, people who aren't afraid to challenge the status quo in the interest of doing what's right, which is why we're all here. And it's possible to give these kids a real better chance of getting somewhere. So I should say as well, thank you especially to Becky, who I think was shanghaied onto this panel at the very last minute, and also to Nicole, who was in another conference and then, thanks to the miracles of Zoom, was able to also join ours. But if you join me in thanking all of our panel, I was asked as well to give a quick plug to the next really exciting session, which will be Laura Reynolds and Mary Nally talking about how a network of research champions has started in Bradford to drive evidence-based education. So please do stick around for that.